So, good morning, everybody. Let me start by thanking the institutions that are co-sponsoring this event, and besides the Cardoso Foundation, the Cátedra Márcios de Estudos Alemães e Europeus, sediada na USP. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? Frye University, and this research cluster, Script, Contestations of the Liberal Order. I love the title. And special thanks to Tanya Bortzel and Thomas Risse, both from Frye University. You have co-authored a book on comparative regionalism, which is exactly the topic of this event today. So let me just thank you once again for making the time to be here. And we have a combination here that you will speak, each one of you, for about 25 minutes, and then we can have a Q&A with the audience. Having said that, we haven't decided yet who will go first. I think you will go first.
You start.
Okay, you go first, Tanya.
And then only briefly. First of all, Thomas and I, we are really thrilled to be here. So thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to talk and to engage in a discussion with you. So we really want to limit ourselves to 45 minutes because we are one of the main reasons why we're here. Apart from the fact that Brazil is a beautiful country, and at least I have never been to Sao Paulo, so I'm really happy to be here, is that USP is one of the international partners of our cluster of excellence, Freie Universität Berlin, has successfully applied for last year. Cluster of Excellence is a major research center. Think of it as a research center plus a graduate school plus a center for advanced studies. And so it's a 7-year research program. And the research agenda we are pursuing is we want to find out why it is that liberal institutions and ideas are increasingly under pressure, both at the domestic level and at the international level. That is our research program. We want to find out what is contested, why, and to what effect. What does it do to us and the world? And as I said, USP is one of our international partners. So we look at contestations of what we call the liberal script in a global context. We're not only focusing on Trump in the US and the rise of authoritarian populism in Europe, but we also look at other countries. And Brazil, of course, is an interesting case. So today, though, we will talk about the international level. We want to explore a little bit to what extent the liberal international order is in crisis, and then focus on the role of regionalism. Again, I think Brazil is an excellent place to discuss about the role of regional organizations and regionalism more broadly as part of the problem, part of the contestations of the liberal international order, or part of the solution. And we look very much forward after our talk to engage in a debate and to learn from you what you think is going on in this country, but more broadly speaking, in the region, particularly with regard to the liberal international order, because Brazil has had a very important role in setting up and also in sustaining the liberal international order. So this is what we've come for, and with that, I think I hand over to Thomas, who will talk about the liberal international order in its origins, and then I will take over and explore a little bit the role of regionalism in this whole problematique.
So thanks again for inviting us. It's my second time in Sao Paulo, but my first time here.
I think you should speak closer to the mic.
I used to, people called me a Napolitano, because I'm always, so I'm trying to stick here. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, for those of you who've been at our talk at USP yesterday, I'm afraid this is a rerun, the first part, but I promise the second part is completely new. We didn't touch upon this yesterday. So my task at the moment is to talk a little bit about the liberal international order. What the heck is this? Where does it come from, and what are the main challenges? And then Tanya will talk about what it means for what the current situation means for regionalism. So the first, I think, the most contested term in the whole concept of liberal international order is, of course, the term liberal, because I mean it's a highly contested term. It is pretty unclear what it means. It is politicized. You know, before we were here, we were in Mexico, and before that, we were in the U.S. If in the U.S. you use the term liberal, it's toxic. It's really toxic. You can't use it at the moment because you're immediately identified in some really left-wing, socialist, almost Marxist type of corner. So let me be very, very clear what we mean by the term liberal here, and that has to do also with the cluster and the cluster of excellence. We are referring to a particular type of philosophy that is actually originated in Europe, but has sort of universal claims, if you want. And at the very core is the idea of individual self-determination. So self-determination as the core, and then all kinds of ideas rank around this. You know, like liberal as in freedom, etc., etc. So it is not wedded to any kind of political ideology. I mean, in our country, we have a Free Democratic Party that calls itself the Liberal Party, but it doesn't have an exclusive claim on the term liberal in the way we are using it here. I just wanted to make that very clear so that we don't get into kind of misunderstandings what people mean. We are also talking, and that is very important for us, we are talking about the liberal international order and not the Western international order. Because there is, particularly in Western countries, that is in the US and in Europe, there is a kind of mythology as if the international order that was created after World War II was somehow the invention of the United States, plus a little bit of European, mainly British help. And that is a mythology. It's historically wrong. I'm not saying that the US was not important, but a lot of other countries were actually involved of what we talking about when we talk about liberal international order. So in our view, the liberal international order, and we can discuss this later on, what you think about it, has kind of three components. The first is a political component, and we refer to this as political liberalism. The second one is an economic component. We refer to this as economic liberalism. And the third component is a specific component about the nature of the international order. You can call it liberal internationalism. So I'm going to go through each of those. So let me start with political liberalism. The core ideas are here human rights, rule of law, democracy, etc. And these ideas, you know, are sort of directly related to the core of liberal philosophy. And if we talk about this now for the international order, it means that basic human rights are not just an issue of domestic jurisdiction, but also an issue of international law. Okay, so we're talking about the international order here. The origins, I'm not going to go into a long historical analysis. Let me simply start with the post-World War II situation. A lot of these ideas are enshrined in the United Nations Charter of 1945 and, of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. And at that point, I want to come back to this mythology that it is all about American hegemony after World War II that instituted this stuff. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights would not have come about without Latin American input. The Latin Americans were extremely important with the Universal Declaration. By the way, also some Iranian diplomats. The history is very, very interesting, and it's simply a myth that this is all American made. So I guess my point is there was an initial buy-in on this order that goes way beyond of what you can call the Western core. In fact, Brazil was extremely important at the time. Now, let's fast forward it because I start running out of time already, Tanya, no? Yes?
Okay.
Am I doing okay? So right now we have, we essentially have a global human rights regime consisting on a whole set of international agreements, etc. And we have various regional human rights regimes. The most prominent are the European human rights regime and the American human rights regime in the OAS and with the Inter-American Court, etc. And some of these agreements are rather intrusive. That is, I mean, first of all, the idea of human rights, that people have individual human rights, is already an intrusion on a traditional understanding of national sovereignty, because how you treat your citizens is then no longer your kind of domestic domain, but it can be intruded. And give you one example, by international law, the prohibition against torture, even if a country is not a member of the specific conventions, it is part of jus cogens in international law. It is considered a general principle of international law that it is prohibited to torture people, you know, and that had a very contested discussion 15 years ago after the invasion of 15 years ago after the U.S. invasion of Iraq and so forth, Guantanamo Bay and all of that. So we have a rather intrusive human rights regime, and what is really interesting is that there's not a single state in the international system that is not treaty partner in at least 2 to 4 of these international human rights agreements. So you might think Saudi Arabia, not really a liberal state, or China, not really a liberal state, Russia, etc., etc. They all are treaty partners in a lot of these agreements. You know, I'm not talking about their compliance. That's a totally different story. You know, we all know that there is torture and so forth. But I mean, at least as far as the commitment is concerned, these are really universal values, and one should, I mean, given the current situation, the current debates, one should not forget that states at least have committed to this, to these type of principle. Of course, there is a liberal core, the so-called Western democracies, North America, Europe, Japan, etc., etc., etc. But I want to play that down a little bit for the moment. The second component of the liberal international order is economic liberalism. Market economy, open and a rule-based trade system. Once again, the origins is actually, you can actually put it to a particular location, the Bretton Woods Hotel in New Hampshire in the United States in 1944. There the sort of all the big post-war international agreements were negotiated, the IMF, the World Bank, and the GATT. And the picture on the slide, this is, you know, I think it's an all-male thing that has changed quite a bit in the meantime. But these old males sitting there, they were discussing it. And once again, the established wisdom on Bretton Woods is that it was essentially a US-dominated, and then UK. John Maynard Keynes was the chief negotiator for Britain at the time. That is a US-UK thing. I learned 2 days ago in Mexico City that that is actually not the case, that the Mexicans were very involved in this agreement. So there is always, I mean, again, if we're talking about an open international economic order, there has been buy-in from other countries from the very beginning. So again, cut a long story short, we go from the gut. By the way, an interesting tidbit on this. Originally in Bretton Woods, they agreed to have the International Trade Organization. So they wanted to create an international organization to govern world trade, like, you know, IMF for currency issues and monetary issues, World Bank for development issues, and then for trade issues, the ITO. Where did the ITO fail? Why did that not come into being? Because the US Senate refused to ratify it. Again, you know, we have this idea that the US is the anchor of this order, etc. Yes, there is some truth to it, but I mean, the US also had a rather ambivalent position toward very intrusive international organizations from the very beginning. And if you want the what was originally designed as the ITO only came into being in 1995 with the WTO, with the World Trade Organization. We have all kinds of regional free trade agreements, and we're going to go there later on in the second part of the talk when we talk about these various regional orders and regional agreements. So I'm really short about, and you know all about this. One thing we are specifically interesting to hear your views on what is going on with the Mercosur-EU agreement and so forth. But I believe that my last pointer on the economic on the liberal on economic liberalism and the liberal international economic order. I think what this has done to some extent, it has to totally change the nature of international economic exchanges. So when we talk about globalization of trade, investments, capital markets, etc., what we really talk about is trade within companies and between companies. That is about, by now, at least among the various capitalist centers, that's between 70 to 80% of the trade. So, you know, the old story about trade, you know, comparative advantage, where Portuguese red wine versus British wool, that's the old story that you hear in the first semester, you know, about why trade makes sense. That is no longer the reality. We're talking global value chains. Yeah. So if you take out your smartphone, the components of that have traveled the entire world, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why one of the companies that is most hurt by the Chinese-US trade dispute at the moment. Do you have an idea which companies that might be?
Apple.
No, it's not Apple. It's BMW. It's the German automaker. Why? Because the BMW, and by the way, Daimler too, they produce in South Carolina. Oh no, that's the final assembly. They don't produce. That's the final assembly of cars. And most of their stuff, they are the largest exporter of US assembled cars to China. And since their stuff is going back and forth between China and the United States, they are actually really hurt, which then in turn hurts the German economy. So we are directly affected by the this tells you about this globalization and what these trade disputes actually do if you think in value chains. Last point, and I'm done. Tanya, how many
Already?
minutes?
My goodness.
Yeah. Tanya, done. So let me talk last not least about liberal. Anna, I have one more, but about liberal internationalism. And this was theorized among international relations scholars, mostly by John Ruggie, that there is behind liberal internationalism, there is the idea that before you, while unilateral decision-making is not excluded, you try to solve global governance issues first multilaterally. And multilateralism just does not simply mean you sit in a room, try to figure out a compromise, but yet that you work toward a common, be it global or regional solution. Same with the peaceful resolution of conflicts. And once again, if we talk about principled multilateralism, Brazil, from the very beginning, has been part and parcel of it. You know, and the person after which this Fundação is named, I mean, he's a living example of this. And one of the things I'm really curious about right now, and I want to have your input, what's going on with the role of Brazil? You know, I'm an international relations scholar, and I'm always amazed how significant Brazilian diplomacy is and has been. For example, in the United Nations, the Millennium Development Goals would not have existed without Brazil. The Sustainable Development Goals, to get the Global South behind the Sustainable Development Goals, is to a very large extent the result of really, it's not in the media, etc., but really Brazilian diplomacy. And I really want to know what's going on in this country. So, once again, UN Charter, UN Security Council. I'm sorry?
Me too.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, but then has to do with our cluster of excellence. We want to know what the heck is going on. So, this has all led to all kinds of, and I can be very short about this because we're going to talk about this later on, both on the global level, all kinds of agreements, etc. Amazingly, the climate change regime is alive and kicking, even though the US hasn't really legally left it yet. It is still an announcement. It's an interesting thing, but that's on the side. We have all kinds of regional and what we call multi-purpose organizations. These are not organizations that cover just one issue, but that have a whole range of issues. The largest of these regional multi-purpose organizations, of course, the European Union, but there's also Mercosur, there's ASEAN, there's the African Union, etc. And what this liberal international order under this third theme has done, it has resulted into deep intrusions into national sovereignty through the pooling and delegation of authority to the international level. You know, think courts, think all kinds of dispute settlement systems. So it's really intrusive. And one of our arguments is that maybe that intrusiveness has caused some sort of backlash. And Tanya will talk about this a little later, but before Tanya starts, let me just give you an overview about the current challenges.
You still have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, good, okay. Fine. So there are internal challenges and there are external challenges. The internal challenges is the rise of illiberal and mostly right-wing populism across the world. Let's start with Trump. Somebody else is on that list too. Then Orban, Boris Johnson, and Duterte. By the way, and we had a big discussion about that at USP yesterday, one very interesting tidbit of information is that economic nationalism is no consensus among these right-wing populists. Boris Johnson, you know, our Brexit leader, we can talk about Brexit if you want later on, but our Brexit guy is even more free trade than the EU. He's against the EU because of all the regulations. He's not against the European Union because of free trade. So Trump and Boris Johnson, in that sense, are on completely opposite side when it comes to economic liberalism. Then there are, of course, all kinds of external challenges. I would name one because I think we need to we need to really distinguish this. There's no doubt that China is either a rising power or already a superpower, and it has a really ambivalent position concerning the liberal international order. I could go through this. I have another talk where I talk about this, but with my 1 minute. On economic liberalism, they are in favor of the WTO reform. There are deep issues concerning their own economy. On all kinds of global governance issues, currently China is in the driver's seat. For example, the EU and China are working very closely together on the climate change issues, etc. So human rights, of course, is a totally different matter. So China is very ambivalent. So we can talk about this, what this means in the question and answer session. Second external challenge, Russia. In my view, Russia is not a rising but a declining power. The R in BRICS, in my view, makes no sense. It's not an emerging economy. It's currently actually what Putin has done over the couple of years is made the economic situation of Russia worse rather than better. We can discuss this. And its place way more, and it's interesting to compare China and Russia because Russia has really this disruptive kind of role, whereas China is partly constructive, partly much more ambivalent. And then the liberal, let's imagine for a second that neither Trump, Bolsonaro, Orban, all these types wouldn't exist, that China wouldn't exist, and Russia would also not exist. We still would face, in the liberal international order, some really serious challenges, compared to which maybe the other challenges are actually minor. Now, of course, we are Europeans, and currently climate change is the #1 topic in Europe. It has trumped all the opinion polls across Europe as the #1 issue people are concerned about. And precisely today, there are demonstrations everywhere in Europe. I heard yesterday that the Fridays for Future movement is starting in Brazil. For the last year, this was going on in my country, etc. So we have climate change issues. We have the migration pressures. By the way, they are related. Countries have to deal with migration one way or the other. We have the, in industrial revolution 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, I don't care how you call it, digitalization, etc., etc. So there are all kinds, and I could go on, there are all kinds of, if you want, objective challenges that if the liberal international order were not under pressure because of the internal and the external challenges, we still would face real serious issues. And I stop here, and Tanya goes on and talks about regionalism.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let me get my timer on here.
I will control.
You will control, yes.
I don't believe in self-control.
Well, me neither, but I can at least pretend, okay?
As you just noticed.
Okay. So, again, I apologize to those who attended our talk yesterday. There will be a little bit of overlap, but not so much, because I want to elaborate on what I've started to explore yesterday, that regionalism is a major driver of the current contestations of the liberal international order Thomas has just introduced. And this graph, okay, I don't want to spend too much of my time on this graph, but what this graph shows is essentially that what we see in the liberal international order, which has always been liberal, but this is from a paper I co-authored with Michael Zürn, with whom I coordinate the Cluster of Excellence. We argue that the liberal international order thickened after the end of the Cold War. That is, it became more liberal and it became more authoritative. Not in the sense of authoritarian, but authoritative, meaning that the strength, the authority of international institutions got strengthened substantially, and the liberal purpose they have pursued got broadened. So, and what does that mean? With regard to economic liberalism, we see a broadening from free trade to broader issues such as, on the one hand, free movement of capital and free movement of services, and also free movement of people, although that's the current backlash against migration is part of that. And We also mean social and environmental regulations. For those of you who are familiar with the Mercosur EU trade agreement, there is a lot about consumer rights, about environmental standards, about social standards, a kind of moving beyond simply deregulating national markets towards re-regulating markets, but at the international level. So at the economic realm, we see a broadening of economic liberalism here. With regard to political liberalism, we see a broadening from human rights towards democracy, rule of law, and also good governance, which mostly means fight against corruption. So a lot of international institutions have adopted a democracy clause and also protective mechanisms with regard to the rule of law and also fight against corruption. And what this graph shows is that both the authority of international institutions in terms of taking decisions, for instance, by majority vote rather than by unanimity, delegating decision-making competencies and also enforcement competencies to independent bodies such as dispute settlement mechanisms or bodies or courts or central banks. So what you have is essentially a weakening of the capacity of states to prevent decisions that go against their interests to be adopted by international institutions through mechanisms such as majority vote, or by simply completely delegating such decisions to bodies that are no longer directly controlled by states, right? And that strengthens the authority of international institutions. Together with their broadened liberal purpose, that leads to an increased liberal intrusiveness, i.e., not only the capacity of international institutions to interfere with national sovereignty, but with a liberal purpose, right? And taken together, we argue that has been a major driver, not the only one, but a major driver of the contestations of the liberal international order we observe around the globe. Now, the next point I want to make is that regionalism or regional organizations have been a major part of this development. A lot of this strengthened liberal intrusiveness is actually done by regional organizations. Just to give you a few examples. The European Union has always been extremely liberally intrusive, right? It is the prototype of a liberal intrusive international institutions from the very beginning. But even here, and I don't want to bore you with any details, but even the liberal intrusiveness of the European Union has vastly increased after the end of the Cold War. Think about the Maastricht Treaty, 1992, the creation of a common currency, the European Central Bank. The entire talk about austerity policy in the European Union is very much driven by the monetary union, right? Just one example, but also the democracy clause in the European Union. Other regional organizations have followed suit. And I want to give you just a few examples, most prominently in Africa, the African Union, ECOWAS, the West African Economic Community, the Southern African Development Community. There are a whole range of regional organizations that have both broadened their scope in terms of moving from a purely economic or a purely security organization towards then adopting economic and security issues depending from where they came from. So they have broadened their tasks and also their authority, moving towards majority rule, creating courts, a major development. All major regional organizations have a court now with varying competences, but still. So there is a certain institutional convergence with which it came a strengthening of the authority of regional organizations. Okay, again, I could go on. I could talk about even Mercosur has deepened to some extent, not so much as some other, particularly the African regional organizations. ECOWAS has the power to militarily intervene in its member states without even requiring the consent of that member states. European Union is not even close to getting such competences here. So, okay. Yes, that is a very good point. I should talk more slowly, and I apologize to the translator here. There you go. I get carried away here. Okay, I'll try to be a little bit slower here. Okay, so regional organizations again, just to repeat the point.
Revenge.
Embody. I get 2 minutes. Embody that move towards more liberal intrusiveness. We describe as a transformation of the liberal international order of the post-Second World War time. We call liberal multilateralism to a post-national liberal order. And this post-national liberal is essentially a summary of a broadening of the liberal purpose of international institutions and their authority. And the result is that liberal institutions evermore interfere with the national sovereignty of states. And they can do so because they have the authority to do so. And that's what we're currently witnessing is a backlash against this liberal intrusiveness. And again, the regional organizations are actually a very strong part of this development. Okay, now that is the first point I wanted to make. Now, the interesting question is, and we should briefly talk about why has this happened right after the end of the Cold War? Because the end of the Cold War created a critical juncture that opened the possibility for this kind of deepening of the liberal authority of regional organizations, but it doesn't exactly explain why it happened, right? So what were states thinking when they deepened the liberal authority of, in this case, regional organizations? And so in the literature has identified essentially 3 main motivations. One is comes from the literature on democratic lock-in. There is an argument, and I think it has been convincingly shown, that democratizing states use regional organizations to lock in the transition to democracy. The European Union with the Central Eastern European post-communist states is a prominent example, but these arguments have been made for Mercosur. These arguments have been made for some of the African regional organizations. So you have countries that started to democratize and that try to sort of lock in these democratic changes at the regional level. And that explains why regional organizations, including Mercosur, but also the West African Economic Community, they have democracy clauses that allow, in case of ECOWAS and also in case of the Southern African Development Community, to militarily intervene in a state in case of a non-democratic change in government. A coup d'etat, essentially, right? So this is one argument, and that doesn't explain, though, why even non-democratic regional organizations have created certain mechanisms, and that is the second part then of the argument. ECOWAS, for instance, the West African Economic Community, is not exactly a deep democratic regional organizations, right? And still they have installed this democracy clause. Why have they done? And the African Union has also a democracy clause, and the majority of African states are at best weak democracies. So why do they do this? And the reason behind it is that it's about stability and security in the region. It's about when you have a coup d'etat in your neighboring country, it's very often that may spill over to your own country. So there is an interest to keep the stability in the region and make sure that you don't have rebel groups that don't care about borders, right? So these kind of negative externalities, to contain them explains, to some extent at least, why even regional organizations that are not dominated by democratizing countries have opted to protect democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. And the third argument we have is regime boosting. You increase the legitimacy of a regime, and that works for both democratic and non-democratic regimes, by creating regional organizations. It also allows you to tie in important neighbors. The Eurasian Economic Union, created by Russia, is one example. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization would be another. So what I'm saying is, even states that are not democratic have an interest in institutionalizing mechanisms at the regional level that allow them essentially to manage disputes and problems of instability in their neighboring countries. And that has been a major driver for, on the one hand, strengthening the authority of regional organizations and also deepening their liberal purpose. Okay, in a nutshell, that is what has been going on. Now, why do we see now this backlash against these developments? And just to give you a few instances of this backlash, the Southern African Development Community just got rid of its court. That court was created essentially to settle dispute when it came to economic issues. The court decided to take on also human rights issues related to the to land reforms in Zimbabwe. It ruled against Mugabe, who just died, but still. And eventually, the member states decided to suspend and finally abolish the tribunal. So that is a typical example of a pretty extreme backlash against the liberal intrusiveness of regional organizations. And just one, you could say Brexit is another instance, right? If you listen to the slogans of the Brexiteers in Britain, take back control, it is a clear rejection of the liberal intrusiveness of the European Union. The same with people like Orban in Hungary or Kaczynski in Poland when the European Union tries to sort of go against democratic backsliding, or trying to relocate refugees, right? It's an interference with national sovereignty. The European Union has no authority or should have no authority to do this. These are the kind of backlashes we are talking about. Now, why is this happening, or what is sort of driving this? And so we identify, again, three reasons. One is that with the liberal intrusiveness of international institutions in general and regional organizations in particular, you institutionalize a certain inequality. This whole idea, one state, one vote, is abolished, right? And so you can adopt decisions by majority. That essentially should affect all states equally, but some states are more equal than others, right? Look, just to use the example I know best, Germany and France are clearly dominating the European Union, right? And without them, nothing really goes forward, and against them, nothing goes forward. So majority decisions have also a tendency to empower certain states. Some institutions clearly have an institutionalized inequality. Think about the United Nations Security Council, where you have 5 permanent members who have a veto over each and every decision that is taken. Think about the World Bank or the International Monetary Funds, where some states have a larger say than others, right? So there is this inequality issue. Coupled to this, second point, is double standards. You know, the liberal norms and values, the promotion and protection is not evenly applied, right? I mean, the European Union sanctions some states for democratic backsliding, while others go away. The European Union goes after some states that don't comply with its rules for budgetary rules, and not after others. It's just this kind of perception of double standards, that powerful states get away, whereas less powerful states have to suffer what they must to paraphrase, who was that? I think Ken Walz said it, right? Okay, and the third one, and I think that is the most critical reason, is the democratic deficit of international institutions in general and regional organizations in particular. Despite the fact that many regional organizations have created parliamentary assemblies, again, a kind of global trend for regional organizations, these parliamentary assemblies have very limited power. And some argue, even in the European Union, where the European Parliament is the co-legislator, right, that is not sufficient to sort of give the European Union the democratic legitimacy it requires, given the extent of liberal authority it has acquired. We can argue about that, but there is a very powerful discourse in the European Union, particularly by populist parties, that is not easy to simply dismiss, arguing, what right has the European Central Bank to interfere with the parliamentary decision of Greece or Italy to increase social spending, right? The European Central Bank has no democratic legitimacy, and still it can force countries to significantly cut into their welfare spending. What is these kind of issues? The same with migration. What kind of legitimacy does the the Council of the European Union, by the majority decision, to really force countries to accept migrants they don't want? I'm not saying that I agree with that, but the argument is a valid one, right? I mean, you cannot simply dismiss this as authoritarian populism. So these three challenges that come with an increasing liberal intrusiveness at the international level have been mostly picked up by populist forces, not only in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. They use this to attack the liberal international order for different reasons, right? Trump has an issue with that US interests are not really protected and promoted by liberal international institutions. Others say they are forced in a similar way. They are forced to accept decisions they don't. Their majority in their own country is not supporting, and that creates a dilemma even for non-populist forces. But it is a very powerful argument for populist leaders who can always point to popular sovereignty, right? I mean, it's a sovereignty of the people that is violated by international institutions who have no democratic legitimacy, and that, I think, is a very common threat. I'm not sure whether it also applies to this country, but I have heard these arguments made by Almo, by López Obrador in Mexico. You hear it, I think, in Argentina. I've heard this argument. So there is this issue, and. So populist forces target the liberal international order, essentially turning the liberalism against them and say, you're not liberal enough in a way. And that is an issue we have to come to terms with. Okay, that is the challenge. Now the question is, what about, and I should actually stick to my PowerPoint at least to some extent. Three more points actually. We have, on top of that, we have democratic backsliding within regional organizations. Again, the European Union being a very prominent case, and the apparent ineffectiveness of the European Union dealing with these cases of democratic backsliding. We do have a sanctioning mechanism, a very powerful one. It has yet to be really deployed. It's been invoked in case of both Hungary and Poland, but so far nothing has really happened. But the European Union is not the only regional organization where we observe tendencies of backsliding, and arguably regional organizations haven't been very effective in preventing this. Of course, you always have to ask the counterfactual, right? Where would Poland or where would Hungary be without the European Union? And let's also talk about Italy. I mean, there was some people would say authoritarian-leaning government, but it's been replaced recently. So, and you could argue the European Union had a role to play. But nevertheless, we do have tendencies of democratic backsliding in regional organizations that have a clear commitment to democracy. Secondly, there are these, and this is Latin America, the neoliberal, so-called neoliberal regional organizations that clearly went beyond using regionalism merely as a tool of trade liberalization, pursuing other goals, right? And I don't know, you tell me what happened to UNASUR, but the building is still there, but okay. Not much of an Alba seems to not really going anywhere either. So, and slightly, we have a rise of autocratic regional organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also the Gulf Cooperation Council, the League of Arab States. And these regional organizations play an increasingly important role. Just think about Yemen, and the Middle East. So there are these, on the one hand, you have liberal regional organizations being the target of populist forces. On the other hand, you have non-liberal regional organizations that further destabilize the liberal international order, you could argue. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Now, we come actually to the flip side of it. Regionalism as a solution. I've argued that regionalism is a major part of the challenges to liberal international order, but I would also argue that there are certain, it's an ambivalence. There are good and bad news. And the economic liberalism side essentially very nicely represents this ambivalence. Let me just look at my watch. Okay, perfect. So on the one hand, we have a rise of economic nationalism, most prominently by Trump, but also by more left-leaning. We talked before this talk, we had a very interesting discussion about Argentina. There's still, some countries still do have more social democratic governments, right? The question, of course, is, and same with Almo in Mexico, they have a rhetoric that is more social democratic, but at the same time, in terms of the policies they pursue, not much has changed, really. Well, you tell me. And the same is for Trump. Trump really went after NAFTA, but then renegotiated, and now we have USMCA, which still needs to be ratified. But the agreement is actually, NAFTA required a holdover anyway, and the agreement is not that different from NAFTA, right? So you could argue, on the one hand, there was a backlash, but on the other hand, what has really changed? The same is true. There is the trade war with China, yes, and for the US, I don't know whether it really serves their interests, but what it has done to Europe is that we've been pushed towards concluding more trade agreements, not only with China, but also with other countries. With TTIP being gone to bust, even before Trump, by the way, there has been then a shift through these trade wars between the US and China towards, actually, you could say it has propelled some new trade agreements. We have, within the European Union, we do have, particularly on the left, mobilization against economic liberalism, but as Thomas already said, the populists are actually quite in favor. At least they don't attack free trade agreements. And as I said, we have concluded a whole number of new agreements. We have negotiated for 18 years a Mercosur-EU free trade agreement. Now we have it. Not sure whether it's going to get ratified, but at least we concluded it after 20 years. And as I said, there are a whole range of other interregional FTAs the European Union has concluded. Now, let's move on, Thomas. I have 2 minutes left. So, liberal internationalism, yes. Brexit, okay. Britain might eventually leave the European Union. Nobody knows when, but it's hard to predict what's going to happen, but one way or the other, they probably will leave. But the European Union has been remarkably unified, in the light of Brexit. And ever since Brexit, no one else talks about leaving the European Union. There's no longer talk about Frexit, Grexit, Nexit, Dexit, Decexit, Sexit. Sorry, that would be Sweden. There's no longer talk about leaving the EU. Yes, some countries would like to roll back the liberal intrusiveness of the European Union. That is true. But so far, they haven't gotten anywhere. And again, the European Union is alive and kicking, probably more alive and kicking than it's been for a while. And in the European elections, actually saw a kind of liberal backlash. The Green Party was a major winner of these. We had the highest turnout for a long time, decline. There was a decline in participation in the European election. And in the last one, we had the highest turnout for a long time, plus a major boost for the what we call green cosmopolitanism, which is sort of the opposite of nationalist authoritarian populism. So again, the glass is half full, half empty. We have, as I said, in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, there is a backlash against intrusive regionalism. SADC getting rid of its tribunal, one of the most prominent examples. But hey, Zimbabwe has made a transition, and it seems that with the change in government, there might be some reboosting SADC. So we don't know where it's going, but the trend towards rolling back intrusive regionalism at least has been stopped there. Now, and in Southeast Asia is, see, that is mine, so give me 2 more minutes. It works. Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia is a little bit the odd one out here with regard to liberal intrusiveness, although ASEAN, with the ASEAN Charter of 2010, has pretty much copied vast parts of the European Union. It's amazing. You always have to look at the details, how institutions actually work, but there is a clear commitment to a broader liberal purpose, both economic and political. There is now an ASEAN Human Rights Charter, for instance. There's supposed to be an ASEAN Human Rights Commission at some point. How these institutions work is always a different question, and clearly these institutions are less intrusive than in some other parts of the world, but still, slowly but surely they are encroaching on the national sovereignty of these countries. final scorecard. So, and I think I can do that in 1 minute. So yes, there are challenges.
Any longer.
Yeah?
30 seconds.
30 seconds, okay. So yes, politically and also economically, there are challenges towards regional institutions. At the same time, you know, there are a lot of, I wouldn't say positive developments, but at least we can say that some of these challenges have been severely mitigated. So despite Trump, economic liberalism is alive and kicking, right? Despite democratic backsliding and despite challenges from China and Russia, I think there is the majority of people in liberal societies still support liberalism. And with regard to liberal internationalism, that's going to be my last 10 seconds conclusion. I'd say the regionalism has a very important part in promoting and protecting the liberal international order, but it can only do that in the long run and fight back particularly contestations by these authoritarian populists if it comes up to the solutions, to responses to the major challenges. Thomas has concluded his part. Migration, climate change, and I would also say free trade is not the problem. Social inequality is not created by free trade. The much bigger challenge is fiscal regulation, right? The global financial crisis was a financial crisis, and not caused by trade, by unregulated financial flow. So financial regulation is a key challenge here, a key challenge. And last but not least, the double standards and the inequality within international institutions is an issue. And I think Brazil has been at the forefront of states rightly arguing that there needs to be less hierarchy in international institutions. And so I think these concerns need to be taken seriously. And that is my final sentence. The extent to which regional organizations will be able to respond to these challenges will then determine whether they're going to remain a problem or a challenge for the liberal international order, or actually contribute to strengthening the liberal international order. And I stop here.
Please join me in a round of applause to two great presentations. So as we normally do here, I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions, come back to you, you answer them, and then we proceed, we move on. Yes, Professor, please identify yourself and each one of you and make a concise question. Matthias.
Congratulations, Tanya and Thomas. It is a huge pleasure to hear you and to learn with your lessons. Let me to concentrate on the EU and Mercosur agreement firstly. And my question is, to what extent do you feel that this agreement can contribute to reshape international economic order in such a way that international economic order can be configured by multiple institutions, such as WTO, regional agreements, and bilateral agreements. But Tanya highlighted at the end of her commentaries that the major problem that we are confronted now refers to the economic crisis, the unregulated international finance. And my question is, to what extent do you view a possibility to face this problem in the short run?
Another question, Matthias Spector. Matthias está ali no fundo aqui.
Thank you so much. That was great. I have one question for each. Professor Risa, towards the end of Professor Bourcell's talk, she introduced the word hierarchy. And I was wondering what role it plays in your model, right? Because you're surely right that the origins of liberal global order have nothing to do with US power alone. And the origins are far more variegated. But surely hierarchy plays a major role. What is that role? Both internationally, but also as Professor Bozell put it, regionally, right? The fact that France and Germany play the roles they play in Europe surely shaped not only the degrees of intrusiveness, but also the degrees of backlash against that intrusiveness. And my question to Professor Bozell is this. We really need a theory of what the backlash, what the mechanisms for backlash are, right? Because it's not enough to say that intrusiveness breeds backlash. What are the causal chains that lead from one thing to the other? Because when we look at South America, and here's the case study for you, I think. Take what's happened in South America in the last 5 years. Countries were forced by a very hierarchical international system to reform their money laundering laws, starting with Brazil. And as a result of popular discontent, these reforms moved forward, and then room was open for the Lava Jato anti-corruption scandal. And as this thing kicked off, it unsettled the equilibrium in a big way. And suddenly, we learned that a lot of regional integration, as we knew it, was based on a corrupt scheme for the use of illicit funds to pay for political campaigns across South America. So the mechanism there is the backlash is a produce of intrusiveness that works as an external shock on an equilibrium at regional level. But that's very different from the backlash you guys get in Europe from Greece or Italy or Spain or Portugal. So backlashes, we need a typology of backlashes, it seems to me. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about your project is that it opens up the room for theorizing about these differences. So I wonder what you thought about that.
Okay, given the complexity of the two questions, I think enough is enough. So back to you.
Okay, very briefly to the first issue, the EU-Mercosur agreement. So if this agreement comes into force, it's going to be the largest free trade area in the world, period. It is also the largest, what we call a deep preferential trade agreement, and that means the regulations go way beyond the economic area. They concern labor, social issues, health issues, environmental issues. So that's number one. Number two, the literature, there has been a long dispute in the literature whether these type of regional agreements go counter to or actually subvert the international economic order. So that is this trade diversion hypothesis. Most of the studies I know about say that that is complete nonsense. No, not complete nonsense, that is a little bit too strong, but that there is very little evidence for this, that in fact regional economic agreements foster better global agreements. So that if you want WTO on the one hand and the regional agreements actually reinforce each other. And if you look at the political attitudes inside countries, usually the same forces that would be in favor of an open global order would also be in favor of a regional order. So in that sense, I think I completely agree with your point, and I would be really curious to hear more about whether this EU-Mercosur agreement, what the fate of this is on this part of the agreement, i.e. Mercosur, and what the domestic situation in both Argentina and Brazil will do to it. Then the hierarchy question. There's a big debate in my field now about hierarchy in international relations. I don't have the time to get into this. I find it it has a very confused conceptualization of what hierarchy actually means. I'd rather talk about power asymmetries. Yeah, there was nothing in my presentation that suggested that that is an order among equals. I mean, that was just nonsense, and that was not my point. My point was if you want, the benign role, if you want, of the United States in a lot of the post-World War II period was actually to subscribe to that order and in a way play when the old financial system, the dollar-based financial system until the early 70s, that was actually the U.S. was the lender of last resort at the situation, and then in the post-Vietnam years that collapsed. But I mean, in that sense, the U.S. was has been at least for a long time, a leading power, guaranteeing this order. What I meant is the good news about a liberal international order is its openness and its open-endedness, that it allows for input by smaller states, all kinds of states, etc. I mean, if you look, give you an example. If you look at the evolution of the international human rights regimes, it has been open to all kinds of new claims and debates. You know, it essentially started with property rights for landowners. This is the origins of human rights regimes. Then came political rights. Then came gender rights, rights of indigenous peoples, LGBTQ rights, etc. So these are universal claims, and we can debate, you know, to what extent power asymmetries, but it's a fundamentally open open system, and that was actually my main point. I'm not denying, of course, that there are power asymmetries, and the same what you said about Germany and France. But by the way, we both, I think you mentioned the Handbook of Comparative Regionalism. We did some work on the question of regional hegemons or regional leading powers, etc., on whether there are sort of positive or negative for regional integration, and unfortunately they are all over the place. Yeah, some are sometimes in the driver's seat, sometimes are blocking. Yeah, sometimes switch from being in the driver's seat to blocking. It comes back to a comment by again John Ruggie on the debate about American hegemonic stability and the argument that you needed a hegemon for a world order. He would argue, okay, but look at it depends on what the purpose of the particular hegemon is. You know, you can have a destructor. You know, you can have really bad hegemony. So, and that the international system as such doesn't explain anything about that, because at that point you need to look inside these things. And I agree totally with you on the typology of backlashes that we need. But this is Tanya.
Okay. Again, I try to be brief. Let me start with Matt's point about the different types of backlash. I think this is a very, very good point. You're absolutely right that in Latin America, the regional organizations, and that is actually a pattern we've also found in Africa, they're used as sort of an extension of clientelistic politics, right? You can give jobs. I mean, it's a kind of reward for, you know, neo-patrimonialism, or regionalized, right? Absolutely. And I suspect we also have that in the European Union to some extent, but it's much more controlled and contained. So I fully take that point. And that is different from the backlash in the European Union. But what, you know, when you go a little bit up the ladder of abstraction, I think what the two things have in common is that regional organizations are seen part of a problem and not part of the solution. And think about the rationale or the legitimacy, and that is the causal mechanism, legitimization for liberal intrusiveness at the regional or international level has never been one about democracy, and arguably cannot be about democratic legitimacy, right? It's very hard, even if we agree there is such a thing as a world society, you know. I don't want to get in this no demos discussion that there is no European people and hence there can be no European democracy, but there is a challenge. There truly is. It's also a matter of size And so there are limits to democratic legitimacy at the regional and certainly at the international level. So we have to think of other ways of legitimization. And what are these? It's effectiveness, problem-solving capacity. The idea or the argument always been we need to do that at the regional or international level because the nation state can no longer deal with these issues. Climate change being the most prominent example. You can add migration. You can add a lot of things. Now, and for the longest time, regional organizations, I think, have helped to solve these problems. Now, with the global financial crisis and the migration crisis in Europe, this perception has changed dramatically. Not only does the European Union, has the European Union not helped to prevent the global financial crisis, or has helped to prevent climate change, has helped to prevent social inequality. Some people actually argue that the European Union has made it worse, right? And I think that is the challenge we are facing across the board. Regional organizations and international institutions, more broadly speaking, are no longer seen as part of the solution, they're seen as part of the problem. And that's what I meant when I said we have I agree, these issues have to be dealt with at the international level. But we need to design institutions in a way that are capable of doing this. That brings me to Alberto's point about international regulation of international finance. You know, I mean, that is a long discussion, and I'm certainly not an expert. But 2 points here. Tax competition, I think, is a key issue here, right? We used to have the race to the bottom with regard to production sites, you know? Now we have the same competition for taxes, and Brexit is a primary example for that, right? But despite all the talk about getting out of the European Union because the European Union prevents Britain from striking trade agreements, what is this really about? What does Britain export to the European Union? It's financial services. It's not primarily, 80% of the exports are financial services. And that's what Britain's issue with the European Union has always mostly been about. And only after they didn't get Thomas, was ist denn? Opt-out of future financial regulations the European Union might eventually adopt, and you know, that was the final straw. So I think that is one. And the other thing is, despite all the need for more effective international institutions, I do think we also need to talk about the responsibility of national governments. I'm sick and tired of these governments that blame everything bad on the European Union, the international system. I don't care. Nobody has forced the Greek government to cut welfare by 60% and leave the defense budget untouched. Greece is the second largest weapon importer in the European Union. So they spend a significant amount of their money on weapons rather than on welfare. Is that the fault of the European Union? I don't think so. But what the European Union allows national governments to do is to shirk their national responsibility. So again, it's an issue of legitimization, but the problem is rooted at the national and not at the international or the European Union level, and that needs to be addressed too.
We have time for one more round of questions. One here. Please, can someone...
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Felix Rigoli. I was a former consultant of the UNASUR Institute in Health here in Brazil. And I would like to, let's say, remark or ask you to further this explanation, because what I was reading here in Brazil and in other places is that the expansion of the financial sector is so huge, like 5-10 times the total GDP of the world, that probably these problems of tax evasion, tax corruption, fraud, corporate fraud, corruption in the, not only Lava Jato, but also Volkswagen and other firms, made, let's say, the big decisions, the big decision makers, think, why do we need an international order that can encroach into international capital circulation while we can still buy our own politicians in different countries? that are much easier to buy and much
Cheaper.
so much cheaper, or at least we know them. So my question is, do you think that this may be the main issue behind not the whole movement, but at least the movement, Steve Bannon, all the groups that are putting this forward with an ideology mixed with everything, but in the backstage, the financial interest in not being regulated by international institutions?
Please. Either one or the two. You can take this one, Thomas and Tanya.
You start.
Okay, I think this is an excellent point, and I'm very pleased that we talk so much about finance. You know, sometimes I feel like it's the finance stupid. It's not the economy. And again, something that I'm sick and tired of is about state leaders mostly that make believe citizens who suffer from crisis that it's all a problem of free trade, right? As if we only if we only balance our trade with China, all the problems would go away. A major part of the problem, also of social inequality, has to do with finance and not with free trade. And this obsession with trade, I think, is politically, as much as I think it is important to conclude free trade agreements, don't get me wrong, but it distracts attention from really important issues. Now, and I think there is a strategy behind that, of course. There are strong interests that have no interest in whatsoever in getting international financial regulations. Having said this, I think the Basel Agreement has been reformed in light of the global financial crisis. So there are things going on. But from all what my economist colleagues tell me, it's not enough to prevent another global financial crisis. So I have no answer to your point other than I fully concur with you that there are powerful interests. And we need to somehow, and I think one way to deal with these interests is by having a public debate about the requirements for financial regulation. And I know it is complicated, right? And it's so much easier to blame everything on free trade than to explain to people what is going on with the flow of capital. But I think this needs to be done because, you know, we're just waiting for the next crisis and disaster to happen. And even the European Union, despite the banking union and everything we've done, we are not prepared for yet another crisis of the magnitude we had in 2008. And the repercussions are still there. They go way beyond finance, right? And so I truly believe, and just a final point, that is also goes to us academics. There is so much debate about social inequality. And even the academics, the scholars, attribute most of social inequality to trade issues. And certainly that is part of the story, but it misses so much of the rest. And that is a main concern. So yes, migration, yes, climate change, but also fiscal regulation.
Very little to add. One issue just to explain why the political discourse is always about trade. It is simply a framing issue.
Yeah.
It's way easier to frame it, and you can make people immediately feel it. You know, you lose your job because all these goods are being produced in China. You know, that is easy to frame. And I think that explains to a large extent why. What is interesting, though, is, and I wanted to reiterate a point that Tanya made, that a lot of us, i.e. the academics, actually buy into this. You know, a lot of, inequality, the inequality issue, think Piketty in that book, etc., and what kind of repercussions it had. A lot of political economists jumped on this. And then started to favor economic nationalism, when in fact a lot of the issues were actually about finance. Yeah, and just to reiterate Tanya's point, I'm not so familiar with Latin America, the situation, but the big nightmare in Brussels and in Berlin and Paris is very simple. It's Italian banks. 80% of them are, completely overdebted. And if this thing explodes in our face, bailouts, that is impossible. I mean, even the ECB, that against the wish of the German populace, but certainly with the blessing of the German government, even though they would never admit that, at some point became, during the Euro crisis, the lender of last resort and said the buck stops right here, and you can't. The financial markets would not bet against the central bank because they're going to lose that thing, right? So, by the way, a little point on your remark. I don't think it's really the question of the amount of money. Yes, it's unimaginable, but I think. You pointed your finger to the right point. There are huge financial interests behind that, and politicians are very reluctant to really attack them. Partly because of the competition, because there will always be some safe havens, etc. Okay.
I will abuse my prerogative and to make the last question. It is about China. I want you to elaborate a little bit more about the ambivalence of China in the following specific sense. China is playing a very sophisticated game in the world sphere, which is at the same time being cooperative to old international liberal institutions and being specifically disruptive here and there. But also trying to build other alliances and other institutions which are not based on democratic values.
Absolutely.
Right? So how do you see this going forward? How do they balance these two strategies? And what would make them favor one, put emphasis on one or the other? And in this context, you said Russia is a declining power, but it still have a lot of power.
Yes.
And I want you to analyze this ballet between the two Asian players.
Let me start with Russia. I feel comfortable. There's a book that Robert Gilpin, the retired political economist of Princeton, and who was one of the people who talked about hegemonic stability theory and the rest of it, and he wrote a book about hegemonic cycles and what happens when hegemonic powers are starting to be in decline. They fight this, and he had various theories about this, and Russia fits very much that explanation. I mean, at the time Gilpin was writing, I mean, he would say, okay, this leads in the end to hegemonic war. Now, in the age of nuclear weapons, I think that's not in the cards, but Russia follows pretty much the blueprint that Robert Gilpin described in a book that was written in 1981, I think. So I feel comfortable, and it seems to fit. Okay, China, I think, is way more complicated. I start with one point. In the U.S. now, there is this big talk about the new Cold War, and it seems that the entire political class, whether it's Republican or Democrats, are buying into this. Europeans are way more ambivalent about this, and my sense is on this continent it's also way more ambivalent with this. But I mean, let's not forget the old Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US. There was no economic interdependence between these two powers. This has totally changed. So if we go into a new Cold War with China, it's in a globalized economy, and China is completely integrated in that economy. And I think that changes the entire scorecard for this. Now, I'm not an expert on China. You should invite somebody who knows something about China. But in terms of observing this, there are certain issues that for China are kind of untouchable, and plus where they try actually now to really work against international organizations, and that is anything to do with human rights. Yeah, if you look at what China is doing in the various international human rights councils, etc., they are really blocking this big time. And if their diplomacy is in full swing, if you criticize the human rights record, etc., and at that point, I'd say now for liberal countries, I would say, folks, we have to stand our ground. We know that we disagree on these issues, yeah, but it makes no sense if you give in. That seems to be another impression. China doesn't respect you if you just try to accommodate them. But there's a whole literature now about status in international relations, and one issue is indeed status and respect for a great power. I mean, there's a whole rhetoric, or not rhetoric, but a whole discourse in China about the century of humiliation, and that now China is back, etc. I still think. I'm sorry. I think I should shut up.
No. I will protect you from her.
Only if you give
I
me 2
cover.
minutes.
No, I'll cover you. It's a male alliance now here. You wait a minute. You wait a minute.
Okay.
You go now.
So just to let you know, we are married for 21 years.
Yeah.
Okay, so part of the dynamics is
to come to the point.
Congratulations.
So anyway, to come back to China, I think there are still issues where China is very assertive on certain issues. For example, I think they're shooting themselves in the foot with their behavior in the South China Sea, because what they're creating is simply balancing behavior by other countries, which is quite natural. I think this is stupid behavior, simply stupid, and is against Chinese interests, because, I mean, who cares in the end about these islands? I mean, you can do it for kind of nationalist purposes, but, I mean, it's all about steering up some stuff, and one could easily have a different policy.
There's oil and gas, honey.
A little bit.
Honey adds insult to injury.
No. So I think there is still an ambivalence, but I think the policy response means engagement. Engagement in that sense doesn't mean that you agree with everything. Yeah. For example, I mean, I'm academic, so we know that Xi Jinping is trying to really oppress the universities. And a lot of our counterparts are now having real trouble. And the German government, unfortunately, I mean, for example, here's Nora, she is with the Freie Universität in Sao Paulo in the office. We have an office in Beijing, and that office was under an umbrella of a German, what was it, science house, something like here, the exactly, you know, and the Chinese made it very difficult to continue this. So this whole thing has collapsed. A lot of German academic organizations have left China, etc. And I thought we should have simply stood up against them, and the German government should have told, okay, if you're interested in scientific and academic cooperation, we need to do this on a balanced level, and you can't just interfere with academic freedom like this, you know. So I mean, engagement does not mean simple accommodation, yeah, and it's going to be very tough. At the same time, in a lot of global governance issues, China is now playing an extremely constructive role. I mentioned climate change. Yeah, there's a big change for domestic reasons, mostly in my view, public health issue, environment pollution in China itself. but China has changed its position toward the climate change issue almost 180%. And it's now playing a very, very constructive role, by the way, together with India. And so I can't help, but there is still this type of ambivalence, which in my view means engage. So, Tanya.
I mean, we almost always agree, but at that point, I have a more nuanced view on China. I think China is much smarter than Russia, right? They know how to play international institutions. But that, I think, makes them also more disruptive. And I think the disruptive role they play is not so much, or it's not only at the international, but it's mostly at the domestic level. Because China provides a counter model. And that is both in terms of money and ideas. And I'm not sure what is more dangerous, right? China just, I think, surpassed the European Union as in trade with Latin America. China is more important to trade for Latin America than Europe, not with regard to FDI. And that's why I think the Mercosur-EU agreement is so important, right? But in terms of trade, and China is trying to sort of work its way into, particularly, you know, Latin America and European Union by buying itself into infrastructure. And so I work on Africa, and in Africa, China has been the clear alternative to the European Union, but also to World Bank conditionality. No conditions attached, right? You just have to eventually pay back the money. And if you can't, China owns it, right? That is their model. And also talking about empowering corrupt domestic elites. Sri Lanka has one of the largest airports in the world now. There's not a single plane starting. Why? Because China bribed major local officials there, right? And the Chinese going to own this airport. They don't care if the Sri Lankans are not using it. They want to use it eventually for their own purpose. So I'm not saying, it's not, China has been extreme, that is my second point, China has been extremely effective in lifting people out of poverty, more than any of the ODA of OECD countries has been able to do. That makes it so dangerous. It's a very attractive model because it's been effective, particularly, and you tell me, in Latin America where poverty is still a major issue, right? And if I listen to Almo, for instance, right, I mean, when it comes to fighting poverty, he's not looking to Europe, he's looking to China. I don't know what kind of implications this will have, but so I think the disruptive effect potential China has is not only at the international level, it is also at the domestic level. And China, the Salvini, when he was still the Minister of Interior in Italy, he's been toying with the idea of having, getting money from China rather than obeying the rules of the European Central Bank with regard to austerity. The Chinese bought the port of Piraeus in Athens. They own it. They're buying themselves into Iceland. Trump tried to buy Greenland. In the meantime, China is buying Iceland. I'm just, don't get me wrong. I'm getting polemic here. And there are also positive effects. I'm not saying. But if you believe that China has a different financial or capitalist model because it is a third world country, get real. China is, I think you have here that Lenin's theory of imperialism. I think there is a lot to be said about the techniques China is using, at least you can interpret it in a way. And that, I think, is a challenge, again, that it's hard to address, but I think we need to recognize that China as a challenge to the liberal, not only international, but also domestic order is real. And it's not only money. I'm
not saying it's real. It's not real.
I hope China don't make you break apart. Please.
It won't.
After 21 years. Not here.
And think about it, what it will do to the liberal international order.
I will not take sides here. I would just thank you so much for this wonderful and enthusiastic presentation.